It's a bit early, I know, but thanks for getting here, bright and breezy. I hope you enjoyed the breakfast. My name's Craig Singalo, and I'm the manager here of WorkSafe's Canterbury Rebuild program. I'd like to thank those who have organised today's event, Donna Burt, Michelle Ivory and Kate Wright. I'd also like to thank our speakers, Rob Birse, Doug Daly and Donna Burt as well. Firstly, before I introduce Rob, I just want to take you through why we're here. Asbestos is the #1 killer from workplaces in New Zealand. At least 170 people die every year from asbestos exposure in New Zealand. Breathing in airborne asbestos fibres is a serious risk to health. Once the fibres are breathed in, they lodge in the lungs and may cause asbestosis, lung cancer or mesothelioma. Despite increased awareness and in part due to long time lag between exposure and illness, we are seeing approximately 170 people die each year from mesothelioma, lung cancer and asbestos. Over the last 20 years, 3/4 of all asbestos-related harm related to people working in the construction industry. And we know that construction worker is 20 times more likely to die from something they breathe in than an accident or incident in the workplace. 29 to 30,000 people each year develop non-fatal work-related health conditions impacting on their quality of life in New Zealand. And if you're thinking about the bigger picture as far as work-related disease is concerned, it costs New Zealand $2.4 billion per year. It's pretty sobering stuff. It's my pleasure to introduce Rob Birse. Rob is an assessment manager based in Wellington. He also was the program manager leading the work in the development of the asbestos regulations. Rob's here just to talk about the new regulations and the requirements for you on site. Welcome, Rob.
Right, good morning everybody. As Craig said, my name's Rob Birse and I'm an assessment manager in Wellington City. Prior to the regs coming in, the asbestos regulations, I was the project manager of the team that implemented those regulations. So today I'm just going to run you through some information that you need to know. But before I start, I know when I do presentations like this, everyone has lots of thoughts and questions about asbestos and, you know, what is a trace level, what is minor contamination and what does small works mean. Now, WorkSafe have produced these two documents, the Approved Code of Practice for Management and Removal of Asbestos and the survey guidelines, and they're gold. We're now getting a lot of positive feedback that people don't need to pay consultants to help them out anymore. They can get the information out of these documents. So I would encourage you to get a copy before you leave if you haven't got one already. Now you're going to hear some acronyms as I go through. ACM is asbestos containing material, ACD is asbestos containing dust. You might hear me say PCBU, that's a person controlling a business or undertaking. And that would be normally an employer or a business. And if I refer to a worker, that is an employee, or it could be a small self-employed PCBU working for a bigger company. Okay, so the asbestos regulations are modelled on the Australian regulations, and this work has been done by the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment with the input of WorkSafe, New Zealand and others. From April 4, the asbestos regulations became law. If you have asbestos in your workplace or your work involves you working with asbestos, then the new asbestos regulations will be relevant to you. As Craig explained, we know that a construction worker is 20 times more likely to die from something they breathe in than a single event. 39% of the harm occurs to plumbers, fitters and laggers, 28% to carpenters and builders, 8% to electricians and 25% to other workers. Many of them would have been exposed to asbestos fibres due to what we would now consider unsafe work methods. For example, installing asbestos or cutting it down to size with power saws without any protective techniques or gear. That's why the new regulations introduced licensing and training for asbestos removal that was previously unrestricted work. The aim is to ensure that workers have the right experience and skills to keep themselves and others safe. So the new regulations make it clear you can't work with asbestos except as an exception. So what is allowed? And there is a list of work allowed in the regulations, and this includes research and analysis, sampling and identification, disposal of asbestos or ACM, including demolition, firefighting, response to an emergency, rectifying work to an ACM, displaying asbestos or ACM, mining work that disturbs asbestos, laundering asbestos-contaminated clothing, work involving contaminated soil, and managing naturally occurring asbestos. Now, asbestos comes in many forms, but in terms of the new regulations, there are two key terms that anyone working with asbestos needs to become familiar with: friable and non-friable asbestos. And our contact centre and our asbestos technical advisors get dozens of calls a day on this. So I'll read out this definition. Friable asbestos, which is the image on the left-hand side of the screen, is defined as powdery or can be crumbled, pulverised or reduced to powder using your hands when dry. It has the highest risk because its fibres are easily released into the air where they can be inhaled. Fibre counts associated with work involving friable asbestos can be much higher than similar work on non-friable asbestos. Non-friable simply means not friable and includes ACM and a bonded material, and it is the state that is not able to be crumbled or dry by hand pressure. Non-friable generally carries a lesser risk when working with it. So it is the state of the asbestos that's critical. So the new asbestos regulations are New Zealand's chance to change our approach to working with asbestos and keep more people safe. Business needs to start thinking about their premises, and if they have a building that is pre-2000, it means that there could be asbestos material in that building. Excuse me. They need to determine if the asbestos is in the building and identify the condition of that asbestos and the location of it. And if it is present, they need to have a plan for managing it and reviewing that plan. If there is refurbishment work or demolition work commencing in that building, then the asbestos needs to be removed prior to the demolition or refurbishment commencing. You need to cooperate with others to ensure the safe process when work on asbestos is involved. The new regulations and information will help business manage the risks associated with asbestos. Now, under the regulations, there is a transitional process, so that if you were a building owner and a PCBU, you've got until April 4, 2018 to develop an asbestos management plan and review it. But I know from a lot of building owners and property managers I deal with, they're already doing that now. And all the information you would need is in the survey guidelines. So previously, the licence to remove asbestos was held by an individual and was a certificate of competency. Now the licence will be held by a PCBU, and the PCBU will employ or engage supervisors to supervise the work and workers to actually do the work. Class A licences work involves the highest risk, as they will be removing friable asbestos, but they can also remove non-friable asbestos and asbestos containing dust. Class B licences, their work will involve non-friable asbestos, ACM and ACD. So the actual removal work will involve a supervisor overseeing the work, and for a Class A, they must be present on site at all times. For a Class B, they must be in the vicinity and available. You will see that for the removal of non-friable asbestos-containing materials of areas less than 10 square metres, this work is unlicensed. This was included by the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment to copy the Australian model. The removal still needs to be carried out in a safe manner. Workers carrying out asbestos removal work need to receive appropriate training and instruction. There's also criteria for health checks that must be carried out for workers doing removal work. Licensed removalists must have the removal work supervised by a trained person. Currently, the supervisor can be the holder of a non-expired certificate of competency with the appropriate classification, or someone that has been granted a licence or holds the relevant Australian licence, or they can pass a WorkSafe test to demonstrate competency to be a supervisor. Licensed assessors are required for monitoring and clearance certification, and must be independent to the removalist. This also provides third-party assurance for the remover, the worker and the client. The assessor must be a competent person and hold a tertiary qualification in either occupational health, occupational hygiene, science or environmental health. Training. WorkSafe have been working with Skills.org and the New Zealand NZQA to develop training for those supervising asbestos removal work in A and B removal work classes, and also those carrying out assessment work. The training is based on the Australian qualification and has been enhanced to reflect the New Zealand laws. Currently, NZQA are going through due diligence process, and we expect this training to be available to training providers in the new year. Again, there is a transitional process from April 4, 2016 to April 4, 2018 to obtain NZQA training for supervisors and assessors. As the level of risk in being exposed to asbestos goes up, so does the level of competency required to handle it. You will note that the first two categories only require non-certified training. This means their training could be in-house using guidance from the WorkSafe documentation, for example. Out of that one. Okay. Asbestos-related workers are people who are at low risk of exposure. They do things like research or analysis of asbestos, or they transport it or dispose of it. Unlicensed removalists face a moderate risk as they can remove small amounts of non-friable asbestos. Although their training is uncertified, they still need to use prescribed work methods. This could be the under 10 square metre and non-friable work. Moving up the scale, all licensed asbestos removalists and others involved in the removal process, such as assessors and supervisors, will need NZQA approved training in order to work safely and competently with asbestos. Again, as I've explained before, there's a transition process from 2016 to 2018. So if WorkSafe came to your site to do an assessment, we have a number of inspectors in the country now who are trained and being trained in assessing asbestos removal. An assessment visit would commence with a general discussion about how the work was being carried out safely, and we would want to know who was doing the work and what licence they held. An inspector would check that the workers were trained to do the work and that workers are involved in safety discussions about that work. And depending on what stage the removal process was at and the size of the job, the inspector may request documentation such as clearance and monitoring certificates and other documentation. Okay, so the inspector could also include a more detailed assessment on how the work was being carried out. This could include checking the details of the asbestos removal plan to ensure that all written documentation was actually being implemented, and the inspector could also check the equipment being used to ensure that it was maintained, up to standard and appropriate for the job. Again, the ACOPS that I've been showing you today has good information on what the standards are. And I can tell you from my experience already, this is an area where a lot of removalists are falling down. They're not getting their removal plans and their documentation correct. So we don't have a crystal ball because it is still early days, but we anticipate that the higher risk work will be undertaken by a smaller pool of players. This is because it takes some real investment to get the highest class of removal licence, the Class A. And later on, they'll be getting safety management systems in place and for the business, and they also have to pay for training for the removalists and supervisors. On the other hand, given the removal of asbestos under 10 square metres is unlicensed, we anticipate a cluster of smaller businesses doing this sort of work at a cheap price. So what we see is that this is an opportunity to improve health and safety outcomes for those that work with asbestos. So what are we doing? Now our website is excellent at the moment. We're getting a lot of positive feedback about it because on that website we've got a list of licensed removers and assessors. We've got lists of laboratories. We've got lists of licensed landfills where it can be disposed. You can download copies of the Code of Practice for Management and Removal of Asbestos. It covers all the new regulations and it's a very much how-to document. It's invaluable to people working in the industry. You can also download the survey guidelines. For those conducting asbestos surveys, this is a very valuable document. The survey guide takes you through the process. We also have lots of fact sheets Working with asbestos, what it means for people engaging asbestos workers, what sort of personal protective equipment that people need to wear or use when working with asbestos, and health monitoring for asbestos workers. So to close, we are here to help you and we have resources available. Should anyone have any questions regarding the intricacies of asbestos regulations or practice, we have an asbestos email address that you're more than welcome to send your query into. And I can tell you that later when we meet, but I'll give it to you now. It's easy to remember. It's just asbestos@worksafe.govt.nz. I'll say that again, asbestos@worksafe.govt.nz. I'll just thank you for that, and I'll hand you over to Donna. Oh no, Craig again. Okay.